Jurassic franchise has generally asked the question of what would happen if we actually respected dinosaurs.
It's a dinosaur.
Well, in today's video, I decided to throw that question right out the window and instead ask, what if we didn't? I built Jurassic World from the ground up with absolutely zero regard for our dinosaurs' welfare. But the question remains, could I manage to wow our guests with the sheer spectacle of nature's finest creatures and thus make myself a fortune, or would they side with the poor defenseless dinosaurs who were being forced to live in cages and fish bowls? Well, to find out, it's time to go back to where it all began.
In the beginning,
We start off on the sunny and tropical Isla Nublar, home of the original Jurassic Park and Jurassic World. The first thing to do on this project was to set up the vital starting infrastructure. With a starting budget of only $9 million, the money would have to be pushed thin to make sure we could get a profit before the old coffers run dry. The first building I had constructed was an iconic Jurassic World Innovation Centre. With nothing more than that, a pathway and a power generator, I was surprised to find that our visitors were already eager to visit Jurassic World. As I'm not one to judge what these people waste their money on, I allowed it, and constructed a restroom and emergency bunker so they could hide from the financial responsibility. I helped support these people's ridiculous spending needs and constructed some amenities as well as an activity centre. I also stretched out the paths a little bit to help with any potential overcrowding. Once the guests that I hadn't anticipated arriving so soon were fed, watered and comfortable, I got to work with the important infrastructure, the backbone of this entire park. A science centre was constructed so vital research can take place so the park improves over time, an expedition centre so I could get that juicy dinosaur DNA, and a control centre where the staff administration happens. With my park on the starting block still, nothing had been researched and I was limited where I could send my expedition team. So I decided to start off in Germany, in search of some Compsognathus fossils. Even though there was nothing in my park in terms of dinosaurs yet, the crowds were starting to flow in. It was at this point that I remembered that they actually had nowhere to stay, so I grouped together a team of paid labourers and willing volunteers to construct myself a working hotel before nightfall. They did a stellar job at this. But now the first major milestone for my new project, the construction of the Compy exhibit right in front of the hotel. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that should be plenty of space for these creatures, after all, they are pretty small. I put a viewing gallery in so our guests could get a good look at the breathing grains of rice. A hatchery was placed to the side, and the synthesis and incubation of the Compies began. A meat feeder was placed in the centre of the tear-shaped exhibit, and the Compies were airlifted in. Once they arrived, they were bouncing around in circles, having the time of their lives. Whoever said that these animals need plenty of space was completely wrong. After the successful introduction of the Compies, I decided that I was ready to move on to something much larger, the Edmontosaurus. So I sent my dig team out to Canada, and it wasn't long before they returned with fossilised goods and something to sell. While the scientists were extracting the DNA, I got on with building their new home. I constructed a nice rectangle with a curved corner, added a bit of water and some shrubbery, and the exhibit was now ready for them to be airlifted in. I took a moment to look at the well-being of the Compies, and the ungrateful lizards were complaining that there wasn't enough space in their habitat. If anything, I thought that they actually had too much space. I then watched as the last of the Edmontosaurs were being airlifted in, then watched from the guest viewing platform as they wandered through their luxurious new home for the first time. I even gave them a nest in case they wanted to add to their ranks. The Compies were still complaining about a lack of space, sand and grassland, and also water in their exhibit. They can't be upset, however, if they're sleeping. Eventually I yielded though and did give them some more sand, but they were still complaining. It just goes to show you that you shouldn't do anything for anyone in this line of business. After the Compy exhibit got a bit of an upgrade, as did my facilities, a new staff centre was placed down so I can increase my scientist population, along with a place for them to rest and not get too tired. Another scientist was hired to help with the ever-increasing workload of Jurassic World. The Edmontosaurs were enjoying their new home, at the very least they weren't kicking up a fuss like the giant Compies were. It was time though to get the next species to the park. My dig team had returned from their trip to the southern USA with many Dilophosaurus fossils and some valuable minerals. I wasted no time in getting construction underway for their exhibit for the guests to enjoy. I constructed a rectangle and then split it in half to form two squares, one of which will house the Dilophosaurs. I placed viewing vents in each square, then while the dilos were being transported, placed a meat feeder for them to enjoy. Initial reports from our rangers suggested that the dilos too were a bit unhappy with their new home, but give them time and I'm sure they'll warm up to it. I gave them a second feeder and generously also let them have some water and trees, which surely they'll definitely be happy about. More improvements, however, were being done to the park. First, I widened the pathing to help with the overcrowding, and then I added a power station and pylons everywhere, so the park was no longer relying on expensive backup generators. The compies were, however, still complaining about a lack of water, as if that was for some reason important. I placed down a tiny amount of water in their exhibit, certainly more than enough for their tiny mouths to drink from, at least I thought so. After a while, I was given my first contract for a nice financial boost, and I chose disease-free, which shouldn't be a problem, as my dinosaurs can't move enough to get a disease. If any dinosaur does get sick on me in that time, I will just simply sell them on the black market. I also received my first financial report, showing that I was making a nice healthy profit, just shy of 200,000 a minute, which was always nice to see. In my endless generosity to these dinosaurs, however, I went to increase the size of my compy habitat, altering the pathwork to do so. I didn't think the guests would be my biggest problem in this park, but they were, as they were actually refusing to move from the old path to the new one. Once the guests eventually got out of the way, I expanded the compy's home a little bit, and it was now twice the size that it previously was. But before I could pat myself on the back for such generosity, I got notified of a fence break. Even though they had absolutely no reason to be, the Dilophosaurs were unhappy with their homes and had broken out. After watching this Dilo trample over our guests and park workers, I opened the emergency shelters. In an oversight, I hadn't actually constructed an ACU facility yet, as I expected all my dinosaurs to be perfectly happy and grateful with what I provide for them, so I immediately decided to place one down. To make matters worse, security footage of the incident leaked and was now going viral online. I was given the choice to accept responsibility and donate to charity, or take a blind eye and see a giant hit to my publicity rating. I took the Alan Pace approach and did absolutely nothing, seeing my supporter rating drop down like a cliff. After enjoying its killing spree, this pesky Dilophosaur was eventually hunted down by my ACU team. After many missed shots, the helicopter crew did manage to trank it out. The Dilo fell on top of one of its victims, showing that it can't get away with whatever it wants under my watch. As owner of the park, I demanded to take control of the ACU helicopter myself and land it. Unleashing my inner Simon Maserani, I took the helm of the chopper and flew it over the dense jungle. I successfully landed it back at the ACU base, and the thrill seeker in me was absolutely delighted, making me almost forget that the fence still hadn't been mended. To repair the fence, however, I would first need a maintenance facility, so I decided to get one of those placed down. A new scientist with speciality in logistics was hired, and because I treat my staff really well here, I immediately got him training to further improve his logistical skill. Following the Dilophosaur's little mishap, I also upgraded their enclosure. I didn't make it bigger or add more enrichment, as that would be foolish. Instead, I replaced their original fences with concrete walls, so that when they got airlifted back in, they will find that they can no longer break out and attack my very valuable guests. Over in the compy exhibit, many were low on health, and one had somehow even died. It's like they lost the will to live in here, which I can't understand why. Despite having access to clean water, it appeared that my compies were going on a thirst strike, and were now dying because they weren't drinking. And while the public were turning a blind eye to my squished enclosures, apparently dead dinosaurs was the line that they drew, and my dinosaur welfare rating was tanking. I decided to take a break from the PR disaster that was the compies, and moved on to further improvements in the park, and I wanted to be ambitious this time. I sent my dig team to Canada in search of fossils for the Albertosaurus, which would be the largest and most popular dinosaur in the park so far. I had already built their exhibit, the second square next to the Dilophosaurs. One of the Dilos was once more attempting to break out, but was unable to penetrate my solid concrete walls. I named this little criminal Mischief. At least the Dilos, however, were still showing the will to live, unlike those other little rodents. Profits were now back up to 120,000 a minute, not as high as it was, but slowly getting back up there after our Dilophosaurs had eaten half the guests. My dig team returned with the Albertosaur fossils, and I got a scientist to extract them, and soon we will have enough viable genome to clone some for the park. Another compy had died, leaving only one left, but even that now was on death's door, as it refused to get up and eat and drink. These lazy compies were truly the bane of my life. The endless headache though that was the dinosaurs continued, as now the Edmontosaurs were complaining about a lack of water. So I had to fork out to increase the size of their pond, just so they could drink, as apparently that is important to them. Thankfully these prehistoric bags of meat were grateful for the new water supply and actually used it, unlike the compies, who had now all died. At least this does leave me an empty exhibit for some other lucky creature. I now had enough Albertosaurus genome to make some for myself. I had my scientists synthesize the eggs for a hefty fee, and while they were working I made a nest for the Dilophosaurs so they could do something other than climb out of the unclimbable fences. When I returned to the hatchery, my geneticists were done with both the synthesis and the hatching, so my Albertosaurus was ready to be airlifted into its new, roomy home. In the herbivore exhibit, the other new arrivals, the Lystrosaurs, were settling in nicely, rolling around and sleeping in the grass. Finally, we had found a humble species that appreciated my effort and endless work ethic. As an act of goodwill following the earlier incident, I splashed out on a Ferris wheel for my guests outside the Dilophosaur enclosure. My wonderful guests will truly get an excellent aerial view from atop it. My new Albertosaurus Alfie was making himself at home in his new concrete square. With both a meat and goat feeder, Alfie would never have to worry about starvation in his time here. There was no pond, but Alfie would do just fine drinking in the rainwater. I even took time out of my busy schedule to peer at my new most popular dinosaur from the gallery, and I thought his enclosure looked perfect. Unfortunately, the rain falling down on the island upgraded to a tropical thunderstorm. To keep my precious guests safe, I opened up the emergency shelters. Always one to take an initiative, I remained seated in an ACU helicopter, ready to get to action in case any fences break and any of my assets find themselves roaming across the park. Some of the assets got themselves hurt because of the heavy winds, and apparently it was my responsibility to heal them. I don't know why, as it's not my fault they have soft hides, but reluctantly I constructed a medical facility. I sent the medical team to see out my little gremlins. Whether they healed or executed them, I didn't really care. Once the storm ended, I got to work on expanding the park. First I had to do a little bit of landscaping before I built another exhibit, which I was being generous with, as it was going to be way too big. It would be the Utyrannoses that would live here, a relative of the Albertosaurus, whose oversized feathers will do them absolutely no favours on this melting hot tropical island. I placed viewing galleries down so that my guests would get the opportunity to see the overgrown poultry up close. While the assets that I can't even remember what they were called were being airlifted in with no dignity whatsoever, I took a look at my financials and was pleased to see that my profit was not only back up, but was at the highest it's ever been at $260,000 a minute. When having a look at our herbivore exhibit, I found that the Lystrosaurs had reproduced. While this was more mouths to feed, this was good news, as it was about now that I'd worked out that guests absolutely loved baby dinosaurs, and I began to formulate my master plan in my head. The turkeys did finally arrive in their new home, and the only thing that I could think of was how much I needed a shave. Their shagginess is truly bringing down the image of this park. If my guests were to travel all this way to see these beasts, at least I could make their trip worth it, so I added some food, drink and souvenir amenities in the area. I customised the menus and features of these amenities to enhance guest enjoyment, and I might even offer some coupon days as an apology for what they may have to put up with in this park. I sent my dig team then out on a sunny trip to Spain in search of fossils of something called a Concavenator. I hadn't really heard of it before, but it sounds like an octopus or a squid, so I like the sound of that. The newly arrived Utyrannoses were proving to be guest favourites, so I all gave them a name: Fluffy, Stuffy and Duffy, rounded out 3 of the most iconic names and dinosaurs you'll ever meet. I then received the disappointing news that a Concavenator is apparently a land carnivore, not a sea molluscule, so my plan of building a lagoon would have to go on hold for now. Instead, I built an enclosure in pretty much the same style that I always have, with strong metal fences and not very much space. I gave the Concavenators a nice little space to play in, a bit of food and water, because apparently that is a legal requirement, and ordered the assets to be delivered in. Night then fell on the island, and I took some time to appreciate what I've done so far. I watched the Edmontosaurs, who have been my favourite species as they've just been eating grass and causing no issues, and then looked at the exquisite overhead view of my park before getting a down-low experience with my guests. So far, so good at Jurassic World. Despite overheating most of the time, the Utyrannoses felt comfortable enough to reproduce and lay eggs in their new home. And these eggs hatched in the night, and 2 baby chickens emerged from the nest, doubling the number of dinosaurs in the pen, and also doubling the amount of trouble they'll cause, but of course increasing that attraction rating, which will bring more guests to my Jurassic World. Alfie was still having a grand old time in his square, keeping himself entertained by wandering around aimlessly and intimidating the goats, causing no issues whatsoever. Out of all the assets in the park, Alfie was absolutely my favourite. I checked back in on my financial reports and received a pleasant surprise. My profits have doubled since the last time I checked, now just shy of $600,000 a minute. For some reason, my valuable guests seem to enjoy seeing these dinosaurs on display, to the point where the park is now nearing overcapacity. To resolve this, I had a grand, exquisite 5-star hotel constructed, where the guests can spend the night in comfort. During the night, I watched the Dilophosaurs try and climb the concrete wall for the 400th time that day, and evidently these things are not the smartest, and it's no wonder they went extinct. But apparently many animal rights activists also saw this and have been non-stop yapping complaining about their living conditions, demanding that I do more to make the dinos comfortable as they kept getting injured on the walls. As a man of the people, I doubled the area of their square to make it into a rectangle. I even gave them a substation to play for a bit of enrichment. But if I find a power outage caused by them, I will not hesitate to feed them to Alfie. One of the vermin had picked up another sprain when trying to climb out, so I now had to waste the medical team's time and resources to heal it, otherwise our dinosaur welfare rating would plummet. Fed up now of the land animals, I decided to get some research going on dig sites for marine animals, sending my top scientists away to get it done. Despite doubling the size of their home, the Dilophosaurs were still not grateful for my efforts, and I'm going to take a lesson in nothing I do will ever make them happy, so I shouldn't bother in the future. To make matters worse, they did end up hurting themselves again, so the medical team once more had to go over there and shoot them with some healing darts. I even drove over there myself, shouting at the guests to get out of the way as I crashed into a fence. Overall though, it was a very smooth ride. After its surface wounds were cleared, I watched this chaotic Dilophosaur move on to eating a goat, and gave it the iconic name of Cozy, so I can keep an eye on it in the future. After quickly relocating the maintenance facility to a more convenient area, I got to work on adding more Concavenators into the park, since apparently these eyesores were popular with the guests for some reason. I watched this new one get settled in by staring blankly into space and wandering around aimlessly. Its trance was eventually broken by one of the originals, who startled it by nipping it on the back. Things were getting a bit frantic for our medical team now. Firstly, they had to deal with an Edmontosaurus who had picked up a concussion from somewhere, and then once more they had to deal with Cozy, who had picked up yet another sprain when trying to break out, and was on a critically low amount of health. I volunteered to take the ambulance there myself, but just before I reached the Dilo exhibit, I accidentally crashed into a viewing gallery, losing valuable seconds. Before reaching the gate, I had just enough time for a top-class drift into the wet grass. This type of stunt you only see in the movies. It was pretty awesome. But by the time I'd reached Cozy, it had already passed away from its injuries. A shame really, as I truly did all that I could to save it, wasting no time in the process whatsoever. Oh well, time to get rid of the body and pretend it never happened, and the guests will never know. In some excellent news for the guests and the profits, but terrible news for the meat suppliers and upkeep workers, more baby carnivores arrived in the park. Tyrannuses, who were breeding like rabbits, welcomed 4 new hairy children, while the Concavenators also had 2 new ones enter their home. Special guests who donated to the park were given the opportunity to name the newborn assets. This one here was given the name Jamie, while its sibling was given the name Cersei. Tyrannuses were being responsible parents, watching over their young and letting them wander around and explore on their own. I may have no love for these animals here, but I was feeling a little bit sorry for Alfie, who had done nothing wrong at all in his life and was just getting on with it. He did not deserve to have a smaller home than Dilophosaurs, so I did decide to increase the size of his home, even giving him a fancy groove in his wall. It wasn't just the carnivores though who were having fun with breeding in the park. The Edmontosaurus, who also house 4 new juveniles in their territory now, and since they will eat nothing but grass in their lives, thankfully they wouldn't add any further stress to the park workers. Alfie now had got himself a partner, Athena, but things did not quite start off how I expected with those two. Instead of playing or starting a family, they instead chose to smash each other in the face. A bitter disappointment, and eventually it was Athena who asserted herself as the dominant one of the two. I did put a nest in there for them if they decided to patch things over in their relationship, but Alfie was certainly ready for that and was showing off a little bit with his over-the-top goat kill. The Concavenators were unhappy and trying to break out, and much like the Dilophosaurs, these things were also proving to be a massive nuisance for me. However, despite all this, the park itself was thriving. Financially that is, with my profit now recording at 640,000 a minute, pure, unadulterated stocks. That night I had a couple of glass aviaries placed down by the Ferris wheel, eventually realising that 2 was far too many and 1 was enough, and I actually decided to delete the second one. All of this was in preparation for some pigeon-like assets that I had in mind. And on the topic of lazy birds, the mother Tyrannusus was sleeping away through the night, while her children were restless and wanting attention, yet she was doing nothing about it. The Tyrannusus babies were allowed to pull all-nighters, and were disturbing the guests in our nearby 5-star hotels. Some reptiles just shouldn't be allowed to be parents. But if any dinosaur was deserving to be a parent, it would be Alfie. as he and Athena welcomed 3 new children into their rectangle. I'm sure all 5 of them will have a great time in their incredibly spacious home. As the Utyrannus babies were so popular, with the help of my scientists, we just kept producing more of them. These baby Uties were incredibly popular with the guests, with each juvenile having a far higher appeal rating than their parents. At this point, I was thinking that we were going to build an absolute army. The aviary I constructed earlier was finally about to be put to use, as I prepared for the newest arrival, the Quetzalcoatlus. While I had my scientists prepare the egg, I placed down some water and a fish feeder in its single dome. There was excitement in the park as the word was getting spread around the guests that the Quetzalcoatlus was about to arrive. As they were now parents, I decided that Alfie and Athena's exhibit was due a slight upgrade. I increased the rectangle by a yard or 2, added another feeder, and covered the new area with sand that is coarse, rough and irritating and will get everywhere, but anything to keep Alfie happy. At this point, the guests had heard about the bird, for the bird is truly the word on everyone's lips, and it was finally time for the Quetzalcoatlus to be released into the park. According to my chief CFO, the projections were that it would be the most popular attraction in the park by a mile, and so my ever-deserving guests will get to see it as soon as they can. As it roamed in its dome for the first time, some would say that it looks to be a little bit comical in such a small area, but I say that's nonsense, and it was perfectly happy. I gave the Quetzalcoatlus the name Quack. The next day, the Dilophosaurs finally joined in on the act and became parents. The Dilos had certainly cut out their antics after Cozy had snuffed it, and perhaps they finally knew their place in this park. But Quack was proving to be such a strong attraction that I simply had to add in a second Quetzalcoatlus. I expect that a third one might be necessary soon. Throughout my time managing this park so far, I have treated my staff pretty well. But when this absolute jobsworth stormed into my office demanding a raise, I politely reminded him that he is paid well enough already, and I run a no-nonsense operation around here, so his request for a raise was denied. I checked back in on the Dilophosaurs to see that Mischief was enjoying a nice goat. I then went to check in to see how our Quetzals were doing. Animal rights activists were complaining about something though, so not listening to their whinings, I went to find a solution. It wasn't long before I realised that the problem must be that the birds were lonely, so I started the plan to rectify that, and sent out my dig team for some Dimorphodon fossils, so the Quetzals can have some small friends to play with. After a short time, I gathered enough genetic material to be able to clone the little flying animals, and my scientists got to work on cloning the 4 of them. While I waited, I did give the second Quetzalcoatlus a name, which was Lola. But it wasn't long at all before the Dimorphodons were fully raised and ready to release, and the 4 things were released into the dome. Just look at these things, what an absolute beauty. With the ever-increasing wear and tear around the park, I added another maintenance facility so that my Jurassic World can be proactive rather than reactive. Alfie and Athena found that they were enjoying parenting life a lot more than they thought they would, so they decided to have even more kids, and soon enough 2 more Albertosaur babies arrived in the rectangle. The animal rights activists were still causing a bit of an issue though, and it was all to do with the aviary being a bit too small. So with great reluctance, I did add a second dome to the aviary. I even did though give the birds a nest, which would be brilliant as I'd now be able to breed our Quetzalcoatluses, and this would be a very popular move with our guests. The Utyrannus paddock was looking rather comical now, with the constant breeding of the feathered Uties causing Fluffy to be constantly followed around by a boatload of little Uties. When the Ranger team did get too close, Fluffy let her anger get the better of her and attacked my valuable staff. It was at this point that I realised that she actually had the aggressive genome, which meant that all of her babies also would attack the Ranger team on sight. I could see this potentially becoming an issue in the future. With my park becoming a little bit too carnivore heavy at the moment, I sent out my dig team in search of Ankylosaurus fossils. After I ordered an extraction of the Ankylosaurus fossils, I returned to the Quetzalcoatluses as a juvenile one had hatched from its egg, and instantly knew how to fly and started chasing one of its parents. I named the young one Chad, and I knew it would do wonders for our guest appeal and park finances, which were already looking strong at 645,000 a minute. Apparently path capacity and transport ratings though were holding me back a bit. But I couldn't deal with them yet as I had a temporary power outage to sort, which caused many of the gates around the park to open. Fortunately, none of my prehistoric guests got out, only a goat, creating a temporary petting zoo for my guests. Jamie and one of the other sail-backed abominations were having a go at one another. No idea why, one was probably chewing its food a little bit too loudly. Even still, they were biting at each other's tail and causing quite some pain. I decided to do the responsible thing and completely ignore this, instead choosing to build a new Ankylosaurus home. With half a brain cell between them, I knew the Anks would not be picky or even know that they could get any better. so I constructed a nice small place for them to live, small and out of the way. If they ever did get bored, I even gave them a nice pylon to play with, and added a couple of finishing touches, including water and a nest, and then the enclosure was done. Despite catching them bickering only a moment ago, another baby Concavenator had been born and was welcomed into my Jurassic World. After adding a viewing gallery so my precious guests could get their money's worth, it was now time to begin the synthesis and incubation process for my new herbivores. I decided to make 2 of the giant armadillos, a male and a female. If they wanted to make more later, that would be up to them. 5 Dimorphodon eggs were found in the aviary nest, which would give me more than double their population. It was safe to say that the aviary was getting pretty snug at this point. But now there was finally some peace and quiet in the park, I took the opportunity to resolve some of the guests' most requested issues. I constructed several monorail stations in strategic areas around the park. I then connected them to the path network and power grid before completing the loop. All of this was of course so my guests could hop on and off wherever they feel like. Enjoying the whole park should not be an exercise chore for them. Also in this downtime, and at long last, I finally tore down the old Compy exhibit, as it was nothing more than an eyesore at this point. After the fences were removed, I drained the water, leaving nothing more than a sand patch, which serves as both a nice decoration and a reminder of Jurassic World's park roots. Another thing missing from this park though, and I'm sure that the guests would love, was a park tour. With the enclosures being slightly on the small side, there was little that could be gained from a ground tour, so instead I opted for a hot air balloon tour instead. After designing a path that would hover all over the park's major landmarks so far, and ensuring all safety procedures were being followed, the balloon tour was open and fully operational. The Ankylosaurus soon arrived, and I wasn't expecting much, but I was still disappointed. I knew about their slowness both mentally and physically, but my scientists told me they would be walking tanks. Instead, what I got looked a bit more like walking slabs of concrete. I didn't dwell too much on this disappointment though, and instead quickly moved on to my next project, a lagoon. After constructing a perfect circle, I decided that that was completely enough, and there was no need to make it bigger and ruin the symmetry. A lagoon hatchery was connected to it, as was a viewing gallery, and my engineers designed a drop underground so the guests could get a pristine view. A great white shark feeder was installed, which was expensive both to place and maintain, so the megalodon that will live here better be worth all the fuss. As my finances hadn't moved at all since I last checked, I investigated further to find that my guests needed more restrooms, along with path capacity, and so I added the bathrooms to areas of high demand, and also placed down more amenities in areas where there were none, so that my valued customers could wine, dine, and buy all my merchandise. But now it was time to release the megalodon. I had been told by my scientists and financial advisors that the megalodon was sure to bring in the big bucks, attracting guests of all ages. But I couldn't help by being a bit underwhelmed by it, as it did look a bit like something from Blackpool Sea Life. But still, my guests were indeed absolutely loving the megalodon. Reluctantly though, I did have to accept that I might have to make another lagoon space, so I set about making one. I also, however, saw this as a huge money-making opportunity. Since the guests were flocking to see the fish, I placed amenities down so I could rack up some easy profits. I also customised the buildings to suit my guests' wants and needs, and soon enough, the sharks would be paying for themselves. Soon enough, the second shark was ready to release, much to the delight of my guests. After joining them for a bit in the lagoon viewing deck, I checked my finances once more, and I was ecstatic to find that my profits had gone up to $943,000 a minute, a $300,000 increase. Those simple, basic, massive sharks were doing wonders for my bank balance. Not stopping there though, I added yet another amenity next to the lagoon and customised it to completely maximise those profits. After all, I didn't build this park to make money, but it does help. I found myself once more in the annoying position of yielding to the animal rights activists, and found myself doubling the size of the shark lagoon, ruining the perfect symmetry. Though I thought I would take advantage of this and place down a nest, so the sharks can now create more sharks with the help of my scientists without putting in a single penny more, and these baby sharks were going to be quite the attraction. But another night had now passed, and another group of Eutyranus babies emerged from their nests, taking the total chicken population up to about 50,000. I did need to invest less in new assets and just start putting money into Eutyranus birth control now, because this was starting to get a little bit ridiculous. The slow-minded Ankylosaurs were getting a bit upset now. Apparently they wanted more of pretty much everything. I did my best to accommodate their needs, but I pretty much left them to get on with it. My guests were insistent that I give my very popular fish some names, and because I am a man of democracy, I let the guests vote on it. In the end, they voted to name the first shark Mighty, and the second shark Mufasa, even though it was a shark and not a lion. Not my problem though, as they're the ones who voted for it and are paying to enter Jurassic World. And it wasn't long before there was activity in the Lagoon nest. I tried to do some digging but couldn't get any details, and instead decided to wait outside to see if anything would change. I didn't have to wait long, as the mother shark emerged from the nest, trailed by not one but two babies, and thus doubling the megalodon population. This would do wonder for my guest ratings, as they absolutely love these baby megalodon. After everything she had done to birth and raise those two trouts, Mighty was deserving of a treat, and she got one with that impressive leap out the shark feeder. That night there was more than one word, as in fact there were 3 words, and they were all birds. The Quetzals had laid eggs in the nest, and soon out emerged 3 small baby birds, who immediately took to flight, no hesitation whatsoever. Quack, however, seemed to have managed to get himself stuck on the spot, and was now starving. I'm sure it was nothing to do with the fact that you could barely move in the aviary, so much to my annoyance I was forced to send out the medical team to help deal with Quack. With every passing day though, these Utyrannoses seemed to be causing me more problems. I found out there had been an avian pox outbreak in their exhibit, which has already passed on to every single member of the species, which as you can see was quite a lot of them. My scientists wanted photographs of the infected ones, they knew what they were dealing with, and after half considering letting the species die off, I eventually conceded and got in the chopper myself. I snapped a fantastic photograph, and soon my scientists had enough data to research a cure. Once the cure was found, I had my medical team working overtime so each chicken could be healed. There were so many of the things though that I had to invest in a second medical facility just to keep up. It didn't help of course that the UTs were doing absolutely nothing to help the medics do their job, instead choosing to block the VAM's path and attack them constantly. It was almost as if they didn't want to be cured. But even after dealing with this, my work still wasn't done. It never is. Now the sharks were whinging about their living conditions. The parents were getting angsty because apparently the baby sharks couldn't eat from the great white shark feeder that I'd already constructed. Instead, the babies could only eat tiny fish, so I installed the appropriate feeders to make sure that our baby megalodons didn't die off. I expected some gratitude from the adults for my efforts, but I got none, as instead they were busy making another child, which to be fair, I didn't mind, as this would mean more money in my bank account. These megalodons were doing absolute wonder for my financial reports, with the latest one coming in at over $1.1 million a minute of profit. Yet again, it was actually the path capacity at this point holding me back. The report also showed that I was one species away from becoming a 5-star institution, but I couldn't get to work on that new species just yet, as I noticed a loose dinosaur in the background, terrorising my guests. Upon further inspection, I saw that it was Circe, who had somehow broken out of her cage. I'm not exactly quite sure how this little rapscallion got away with this, but I sent my ACU helicopter out to tranquilise the little demon before she could kill or seriously injure any of my guests. When I checked the scanner report on Circe, I was delighted to find that she was in some sort of pain from surface wounds when she broke out. Good, I thought, that'll teach her. All this action outside and the helicopter overhead had made my herbivores go absolutely haywire in their enclosure. The absolute racket they were making was doing nothing to ease my ever-increasing headache. Away from all that ruckus though and back in the bird dome, Quack had finally stopped being selfless and decided to prioritise his own life above his kids. At last he had decided to move and eat again, and they were all now back to life in the dome. With Circe locked back up and all the problems solved for now, I got to work on the species that would push me over the 5 stars. I constructed 2 more lagoon segments, as there could only be one species to get me over the line, the Mosasaurus, the killer of the Indominus Rex. I sent my dig team off to the States, hoping that they will return with what I need. Whilst I waited for my excavation team to return, I looked over at the Utyrannus exhibit properly for the first time in a while. And I couldn't help but see it did look a little bit comical in here, with all these fluffy mongrels in there. I had absolutely no doubt in my mind that these guys will most likely breed again soon. My dig team had returned, and as expected, they brought me the goods, with plenty of Mosasaurus fossils now in my lab, ready to be extracted. Whilst my scientists got on with that, I had another luxurious 5-star hotel constructed, this time right next to the shark tank. All with the ultimate goal of easing park population concerns, and also so that my guests could rest easier and have some prime comfort with some cracking views. The Mosasaur fossils had now been extracted, and viable specimens were ready to be cloned. But before I could get on with that, I put in some finishing touches on the lagoon. First I placed a nest down for the Mosas to use as they please, and then came the hatchery for the cloning to take place. Then finally, and most importantly, I added a viewing dome, so my guests could enjoy my new assets. I then took the executive decision to construct a new monorail station right outside the lagoon, so my valued guests didn't have to trek miles to see my new attraction. Before I could release the overgrown sea serpent though, I was distracted by the word that 2 more baby birds had hatched in the aviary. Hopefully this time Quack doesn't try and sacrifice himself for the juveniles. Although a new highly rated attraction is important, apparently what I find to be the most important is my guest comfort. Next to my new sea lizard's tank, I constructed another brand new 5-star hotel, which included a pristine view over the lagoon that I'm sure my guests will be clambering to get inside. But now it was finally time to get the Mosasaurus synthesized, so I put my top scientists up for the job, and I had full faith in them to get the job done without any hiccups or delays. But while my scientists were hard at work, so too were my maintenance team, as a high-class storm had hit the island. The strong winds were damaging many fences and buildings, and my medical team were also working hard as the storm had injured a few of these smaller dinosaurs. I myself didn't really think it was worth healing the dinosaurs, but if I didn't, my dinosaur welfare rating would go down, and we didn't want that. The sharks, however, seemed entirely unaffected by the wind, rain and chaos, as they spent their whole time bunkering down in their nest and making yet another baby. At this rate, there may be more megalodons than new Tyrannuses. The mosasaur genome had finished synthesizing and was now ready to be incubated. I decided it would be best to incubate a female first, and got the scientists to work overtime to get that done. Because there were so many young chickens in the Tyrannus pen now, it meant that their feeders ran out of meat at a rather accelerated rate. A ranger team was dispatched to resupply the feeder, but there was a bit of a mix-up in communication, and 2 of the vehicles turned up at the same time. Not wanting to get in each other's way, one of the vehicles reversed, but doing so hit a juvenile Tyrannus. What happened next was absolute bedlam, as the small turkey thrust all its weight against the ranger car, destroying it in the process. I had to take over the surviving vehicle, not only to get the job done, but also to get it out of there in one piece. The spiralling Tyrannus population had now cost me thousands, both in vehicle cost, but also in life insurance for the workers, which I had now lost. Not only that, but Fluffy had swallowed something she wasn't supposed to, and needed to be tranquilised and taken to the vets to get it removed. Overall, I was absolutely furious at the Uties. But when I was told that my new mosasaur was ready to be released into the lagoon, I sat in attendance, hoping it would improve my mood. It did not. I was thoroughly underwhelmed by what I saw, as it was just a bit boring after all the megalodons. The guests had already prepared a name for it though at this point, which was Mossy. As I watched Mossy swim, I did my best to take the positives from it. My scientists had given it some positive genetic traits, so hats off to them, as this would only improve the appeal of the attraction. I was also reminded that this new species pushed me over to 5 stars, so there was sure to be a party in my manor tonight. But for now, there was still a lot more work to be done. You know the drill by now, I am never happy with just one more specimen, and it's time to get to the breeding. So I got my scientists to clone a second mosasaur, which of course had to be a male this time, and I also had to fork out some fish for it to eat. To make my frustrations worse and worse, I noticed that one of our worthless little Dilophosaurs had gotten sick. At this point I was pretty fed up with the Dilophosaurs and all their antics, whining and injuries, and so I decided to have them all tranquilised so that I could get rid of them once and for all. The second male mosasaur had now been synthesised and was ready for release, so once more my busy bees in the lab got to work to get the job done. I also figured that with the apparent popularity of the serpents, along with the elegant hotel that I constructed, some guests will be spending some more time down in the lagoon. And so to treat my guests right, I constructed some amenities to cater to the food, drink and souvenir needs. I then customised each amenity to maximise both my guest appeal and of course my profit, and my amenity designing was interrupted by the second mosasaur finally now being ready for release. So I reluctantly let it out of the hatchery and gave it the name Mason, before I returned to the important work of making sure that my guests could buy some fossilised ammonites. To further improve guest comfort, satisfaction and the feeling of safety, I constructed some restrooms and a grand old solid emergency shelter. I then set my priorities back to the now tranquilised Dilophosaurs. Apparently I couldn't sell them because that is somewhat unethical, whatever that word means, so I had to release them all back into the wild. I don't know exactly where they are being sent, but I didn't really care, as it wouldn't remove my 5-star rating and I just wanted them gone. I hope they're being somewhere that has lots of hungry predators. I had now an empty space to fill within the park, so I expanded their former enclosure and was now left with a very large empty space that needed filling with something else. But the question was, what could I put in there? The mosasaurs wasted absolutely no time in getting a family started, and Mossy emerged from the nest alongside 2 juveniles. I decided to name the children myself without any input from the guests. Realising how huge they're going to be financially, I decided to name them both Moolah and Money. I hope I'm being subtle enough here. The serpents though weren't the only water breathers making babies, as Athena the shark had also given birth to 2 young. As expected, the new baby aquatics were indeed huge boosts to the financials of the park, and I was now making $1.3 million a minute. The path capacity, however, was still a glaring issue, and I finally decided to do something about it. I invested a lot of money into the research of wider pathing, and once I had the resources, I replaced each line of path one by one, tearing up each one and adding a new one in. I repeatedly did this until every single path was as wide as it possibly could be, giving my guests plenty of space to wander around without bumping into one another. Once I was done, I checked back in on the financial report. My profits had dropped slightly because the guests were temporarily inconvenienced by the new pathing, but the results were evident as the capacity had shot up over 4,500. The report also told me that the restroom and shelter coverage could also improve. Not one to let my customers feel unsafe or have to walk too far when nature calls, I made sure to install new bathrooms and shelters in areas of high demand. I am, after all, a true man of my people. Once all the requirements were met, I added some more amenities to the park so my guests could spend their hard-earned money on items that were either overpriced or on things that they don't need. Man of the people doesn't even do me justice. But my amenity placement was rudely interrupted by reports of an asset out of containment. Apparently, my newly placed buildings had caused a power outage, resulting in the Ankylosaur gate to open, and the thickest mince herbivores had decided to walk through it, leaving their perfectly tailored habitats behind. I constructed another power station, showed the shortage will never happen again, and then ordered the ACU helicopter to put the bricks to sleep. To ensure the safety of my valued guests, I did decide to open the nearby shelter and called an alarm for them to make their way to it. Once the assets had been tranquilized, I then returned them to their pen, and the emergency shelters could once more be closed. Chad, the firstborn bird, had now matured and was fully grown. Now the same size as his parents, he still looked pretty small in the aviary that I'd given them. I knew I was being a bit too generous though when I added that second dome. Now the Ankylosaurs were safely back in their enclosure, I returned to widening the pathways wherever I could. I had already done most of the paths, but there were still some smaller ones that could do with a little bit of bulking. I spared no expense when it comes to guest comfort and freedom of movement. When I finished that, I was notified of new life in both of the lagoons. I watched in person as one of the new sharks had been born, before quickly moving over to the serpents to see two young Mosasaurs leave the nest alongside their mother. Both aquariums were now filling up very nicely. The Quetzalcoatlus family was also happy, and many of them were taking a break from flying to take a relaxing stroll along the grass. And I then went back to perfecting the park in my small ways. I maximised on any profit to be made by placing new amenities where needed, and also added some brand new restrooms in areas of high demand. All my hard work, however, was now paying off, literally, as my path capacity work and facility efficiency meant that I was now welcoming in over $2 million a minute. The good times were sure rolling in. All this money, however, made me realise an important life lesson. There is no point in having lots of money if you're not going to spend it. So I decided I was going to splurge on something big. I started construction on a new exhibit right next to the Mosasaur Lagoon, and this exhibit was going to be huge, much bigger than any of the others that I've built so far. I constructed a viewing tower, as the exhibit would be useless if my guests couldn't see into it. I then spruced up the enclosure, and by sprucing up, I mean added a giant lake, a nest, and some fish feeders. I am very excited to show the guests what I have in mind here. I got briefly distracted by some bird watching, and up until now I hadn't noticed just how many birds that I actually had. If they kept this up, they really would be competing with the Tyrannuses for the largest family. After that intermission, I can now reveal that my new attraction is going to be the Spinosaurus. Not the modern Spinosaurus that's been reduced to twig-like and closer to fish than the dinosaur. No, I'm going to be having the old-fashioned Spinosaurus in my park, the one that is bulky and doesn't look stupid. I sent a reliable dig team off to Egypt, but there was no sightseeing for them as they returned in haste with some precious genetic material and some bonus platinum to sell. My hard-working scientists made quick work at the fossils, extracting them with no issues whatsoever, and soon the Spinosaurus was ready to be synthesized. At a jaw-dropping $1 million to synthesize alone, this looming lump better be worth all the money. Once synthesized, I had to decide whether I wanted a male or a female. After some umming and ahhing, I decided to go for the male first, since I liked its patterning more. But then I took a closer look at its traits, and cringed. The Spinosaurus was apparently intelligent. That didn't worry me, however, as how smart could it really be when it had a rock for a brain? Then I saw that it was also going to be both needy and have a large appetite, and I cringed a little bit more. Something was telling me that this creature was never going to stop moaning, and was going to be a nightmare to look after and maintain. But despite my concerns, I still decided to get it incubated for a whopping $1.5 million. Whilst this incubation was happening, I saw that the Mosasaurs were continuing to breed like rabbits, with another juvenile leaving the nest. The Dimorphodons were also adding to their family, with 3 more hatching and innately knowing how to fly. I then decided to take an in-depth look at my park. I was amazed to see how big it had simply become. It seemed like only yesterday that I was making the Compy exhibit, but time flies and the park has only grown larger and larger since then. But with that size came more necessary infrastructure, and I had a second response facility placed down at the south of the park to ease the working demands of the original. The expensive and needy Spinosaurus was now being airlifted into its new home with all the elegance of a wheelie bin in a hurricane. Once he landed, he began to acclimatise to his new habitat, and he had some water and some feeders, so what more could he really want? After all, I used to too dream of such luxury when I was young. My structural engineers did warn me that this new asset could easily break down the concrete walls if he really wanted to. I told them though that this asset would have no need to break out whatsoever since it has everything it wants, but my engineers were very insistent. So I came up with a solution in the most aesthetically pleasing manner possible. I double walled the perimeter. Problem averted. As a man of the people, I take guest satisfaction very seriously here. And when my guests pointed out to me that the balloon tour was outdated and needed reworking, I thought it was an excellent idea and redesigned the entire balloon tour to cover every attraction that my park now holds. Despite costing an arm and a leg, I did also synthesize a second Spinosaurus, a female this time. Despite having the aggressive and intolerant trait, I was not worried, as when was the last time something really went wrong because of an aggressive Spinosaurus? Never. Profits had continued to rise in Jurassic World, now reaching over $2.2 million a minute, and it didn't look like slowing down anytime soon. But my swimming in gold session was interrupted by the news that 2 of the Mosasaurs were ill with a crypto coin something like cure that needed to be researched. Not one to panic in a crisis, I explained to my scientists what was happening here, and they eventually understood what I was waffling about and got to work. And right now it was very important that I remain composed in difficult times, because I had received reports that one of my ranger teams had been destroyed by an Albertosaurus of all things, who had been nothing but civil during their whole lives so far. Not only that, but I noticed that their meat feeder had rotted and was in need of some refilling. So, ever the responsible leader, I hopped into a ranger vehicle myself and expertly got the job done in resupplying the meat. Am I a hero? That's not really up to me to say, but I think I am. But I couldn't gloat in my own triumph, as I had witnessed a brutal attack from one of the savage lizards on the ranger vehicle that I had just driven. Imagine if I had stayed in the car, I might have actually died. Thankfully though, I didn't, and it was just a part worker who did. Grateful that I am still alive, I decided to leave and let the ranger team get back by themselves, as it is what I'm paying them for. With 5 stars secured now in my park, and more money than I know what to do with, I got bored of the old-fashioned dig team extracting fossils, synthesizing and incubating combo. I wanted new dinosaurs, yes, but I wanted to take a different approach. I constructed a dinosaur marketplace facility, and I could now use this to purchase new assets from sellers who are just as depraved as I am. I found a pack of 4 Ceratosauruses available on the market for 1.3 million, and with a seller rating of 25%. You just don't get bargains like this every day. I had them airlifted into the former Dilophosaurus cage and watched them get unceremoniously delivered. They arrived without incident, and if you disregard the multiple counts of whiplash they received, they seemed pretty happy settling in. Instead of bonding and making babies as I've come to expect from the dinosaurs in this park, the 2 Spinosauruses instead began fighting and clawing at each other instead. This was good for the thrill seekers, but the animal rights activists did not like it one bit. However, I was making so much money, I wasn't really bothered about them. So instead I decided to name our Spinos Simon and Susanna. Hopefully these 2 can eventually settle their differences, and as I say that, I don't really care if they do or not, because we are already bringing in $2.2 million a minute. The Ceratosaurs took to their new home like ducks to water, and I would hope so considering they are very expensive ducks. The seller did omit some information however, as I was under the assumption I was buying 4 adults, but I actually received a juvenile with the group. I'm not too upset about it though however, as the guests absolutely love juvenile dinosaurs. While I was looking away, I was disappointed to find that one of these Spinosaurs had broken through their first layer of double concrete walls. Perhaps my engineers were right, although I'll never tell them that. But yet again, my calmness under pressure came into effect, as I simply constructed a new maintenance facility and got them to fix the problem for me. A strong leader remembers to delegate. While my workers did their thing, I started construction on another new exhibit. Made of concrete yet again, I made a near perfect square that was even larger than the Spinosaurus cage, as I truly am in a generous mood these days. I was torn away from my construction work however, by the news that one of my Concavenators had suffered a concussion for banging its head too hard against the wall. My medical team suggested that I tranquilise the beasts and send it to their facility, and I did knock it out, but I wasn't going to spend any medical bills on it, and instead I just released it back into the wild, and that'll teach it for bashing my fences. The humpback freak wasn't even the only seriously injured dinosaur. One of the Tyrannuses had suffered organ trauma, somehow. Instead of giving it the proper medical attention that it needed, I just decided to send the MVU to shoot it every so often with some healing darts. With all these useless distractions out of the way, I could now put my attention back towards the new exhibit that I had built. I wasn't particularly sure what to put in there, and nothing stood out to me, so I refreshed the page, and a new set of assets appeared, and then I saw the perfect listing. A group of behemoth Dreadnoughtuses. Upon seeing these scaly giraffes, I didn't even hesitate and sent my bank details over to the seller. My new assets were airlifted in, not very delicately mind you, but I didn't really care about that. While they were being delivered, I customised their new home with water and low-hanging plants. Everything a tall, hungry sauropod needs. I didn't forget the most important thing though, and that was a way for my guests to get entertainment from them, by installing a viewing tower. And finally, the perfect thing for all family units, a nest, which I placed down right in front of the viewing tower so that my guests can get the best sights possible, and hopefully we can have some baby Dreadnoughtuses. Infighting was nothing new in Jurassic World, the guests loved it, and I didn't really care about it. But in the Utyrannus pen, the infighting had now turned fatal. One of the Uties had brutally slaughtered another, and while I didn't punish the killer Uti, I did brandish it with the name Murderer, with 3 exclamation marks for good effect. My mood was soured when I had to fork out to get the body removed, however, but when I checked back in on the financial reports, I was pleased to see that the profits were still soaring at an eye-watering $2,280,000 a minute. I did eventually fold and give the gravely injured Utyrannus the proper medical attention it needed, and when the medical procedures were complete, instead of returning it to the enclosure, I instead sent it off to the wild, where it will have to fend for itself. That'll show it for getting badly hurt in my park. The Spinosaurs had finally set aside their differences and welcomed in a new one of their own into the park. I named the little duckling Spenny in reference to how much its parents cost me. But still, Spenny was having fun chomping on its parents' leg, the cheeky little rat, and following the early attempted breakout, Simon was actually for once behaving himself now. Newborn babies were appearing all over the park now, and it'd been a while since the aquatics had gotten busy, but I got my scientists back to work to make sure that we were constantly producing more of the park's favourite attractions. Also hatching from their eggs were these Ankylosaur triplets. Their parents finally put their tiny brains together and realised that they could actually have a family together. It only took them 84 years. And also, after all this time, I began to realise that the monorail stations and tracks were massive eyesores. Not only that, but they were largely inefficient when it came to transporting my guests, so the geniuses in the lab came up with an elegant solution, a Hyperloop station. Underground trains that were hidden, rapid, and could carry hundreds of guests at a time, and I wasted no time in getting them installed across the park. To help with the massive amount of electricity this Hyperloop was taking to run, I did construct another power station, a large one this time, to bolster the electricity output across the island. Once I had access to this near unlimited power, I then completed the Hyperloop. Unfortunately, all the underground work had disrupted the day-to-day activities of my guests, and my profit had taken a dip of over $200,000 a minute. I wasn't panicking yet, as I was still making over $2 million a minute, but the drop-off was still disappointing nonetheless. My report also told me that the path capacity was still a major problem and was actually holding us back from potentially making another couple of million. With my paths being already as wide as physically possible, I added alternate pathways so that my guests could get from A to B quicker without all converging on one path. It might have made the paths look absolutely hideous, but if it could get more guests in the park, it was worth it. I couldn't revel in all of my handiwork for long, however, as disaster struck. The heaviest storm yet had hit the island, and that storm very quickly formed a tornado. The tornado struck through the power stations, causing critical damage and shutting off electricity all over the place. This disabled guest facilities, but of course also opened up all dinosaur gates across the park. By the time I got to quickly install backup generators, it was too late. Dinosaurs were loose all over the park, and the only positive was that my important guests were locked safely in the underground shelters. With the tornado still raging on, I got a good view of the devastation that was happening all over the island. To put it bluntly, it wasn't looking good. Almost every asset was out of containment at this point, concrete walls had crumbled, pylon wires had snapped, and I tried to get the ATU helicopter to tranquilise and ship the assets back to their home, but until the storm subsided and the cage walls were fixed, it would be absolutely useless. With power now out everywhere in the park, even the birdcage had sustained heavy damages from the hurricane. When the storm eventually subsided, I was left with a shell of my former empire. With dinosaurs on the loose everywhere, buildings shattered beyond recognition, and my valued customers cowering in bunkers, I may never get this place back to its former glory. But my mother raised a fighter, not a quitter, and I would give it a good go. I sent maintenance teams to work non-stop overtime to get everything back online and working, the power stations first. My ACU helicopters were given the first order, tranquilised everything, and I worked closely with our transport teams to make sure that every tranquilised asset was delivered back to the correct enclosures once the fences were fixed. And I was giving this a good go until I realised that all the Usarana's had escaped and were now wandering around the park. This was too much for me, there were just too many of them, and ultimately I grabbed all the money I'd made and escaped the island in my private helicopter, leaving my guests and staff to fend for themselves in the emergency shelters. Ultimately, life had found a way to survive, but more importantly, Rampy had found a way to survive also. As I left Jurassic World, I couldn't have been more proud of the absolute massacre that I'd left behind. Thank you so much for watching the latest video on the Rampy channel. If you guys did enjoy, do remember to leave a like on the video, as we would love to hit 5,000 likes on this one, and also comment below what your favourite dinosaur in my Unethical Jurassic World was. Once you have done that, why not watch the video on your screen now, as YouTube thinks that you will love it. Thanks for all the love and support guys, I really appreciate it, and I will catch you guys in the next one.